I'd like to welcome Liz Sayce. Liz is Chief Executive of Disability Rights UK, the leading UK pan-disability organisation. This was recently formed as a merger of RADAR, the Disability Alliance, and the National Centre for Independent Living. Liz is also a Commissioner of the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. Liz has had too many important roles and positions for me to mention them all. But she was the Director for Policy and Communication for the Disability Rights Commission. She led a formal investigation into physical health inequalities experienced by people with mental health problems or learning disabilities. She's been the Director of a London Health Action Zone. She spent 8 years as Policy Director for Mine, and she was a member of the Disability Rights Task Force.
As Doris said, we've recently brought together 3 organisations, and we think we are now the largest UK pan-disability organisation that is led by disabled people, led by people with personal experience of disability or long-term health conditions. So over 3/4 of our board must be people who are themselves disabled people, and we work very closely with other disability organisations. We're a membership organisations like RNIB, for example. Hi there. I think we're feeling, I mean, times are tough at the moment in the charity sector as they are in the university sector, and I think we feel that by coming together we hope we can have a stronger voice, a stronger impact, a bigger reach. We'll have more members, more member organisations. So we estimate we'll have around 700 disability groups and organisations in our membership. So on the really big things that are important, like welfare reform, the future of social care and so on, we want to kind of come together and really try and bring together that voice of disabled people to make a difference. So that's our intention. So if you're interested in that, incidentally, you could join the organisation. I'm not trying to do a pitch particularly, but if you want to know more about the organisation itself, let me know. I'm going to talk particularly about employment. And I guess I'm going to talk a bit about the review I did last year, which in some ways has proved to be a bit controversial, and we're waiting for the government to respond to it. They haven't yet responded. But I'll say a bit about that in a minute. I just wanted to talk perhaps, maybe it's just worth saying that within our merger, it's Disability Alliance, RADAR and the National Centre for Independent Living. But Disability Alliance had already picked up the work of SKILL, the Bureau of Students with Disabilities. So for anyone interested in the experience of disabled students and disabled people knowing what to expect from higher education and indeed further education, we're also covering that issue, and we have a publication called Into Higher Education, which is full of people's stories about what going to university was like and so on. So that's also there if you're interested. Right, okay. So employment. I just want to go back to some work that RADAR did last year, which was called Doing Careers Differently. And this is kind of based on really peer sharing of stories and learning from each other about what works in the area of careers. And we're deliberately talking about careers, not work, because I think some of us were getting singularly fed up with the rhetoric about welfare to work, as though just getting into any work was enough. And I think that I suppose a lot of disabled people and other people are saying, you know, actually, we want to feel that this is kind of good work. Not everybody is going to shoot up a hierarchy, but you want to feel that it's work that can be, in some sense, satisfying and fulfilling, where you can develop, where you can grow. It's a career in that sense, not just a job. And in the course of this work, I think it did kind of unleash peer support. And I think it's quite interesting, particularly in hard times like this, when we all tend to get quite negative and depressed about what's possible, if there aren't many jobs out there and all the rest of it, that there is a power in learning from people's successes, and people do get inspired by it. And this is just some of the quotes that people made in the course of this programme, that people were really sharing tips and sharing experiences and saying things like, think through scenarios and solutions, show you're a problem solver, not a problem creator. It was all stuff like, you know, don't go to your line manager saying, I've just been diagnosed with MS. and be upset. I mean, you might do that, but you might want to go and say, and this is what I think it's going to mean, and these are some of the ways we could think about it, and look for the line manager's support, but also go with some of your own ideas, if you can, if you've done that bit of research beforehand. So people sharing those kind of tips. Never give up on your dreams, but be flexible when aiming for them. So some people who'd acquired an impairment kind of said, well, I always knew I wanted to get into teaching, but actually I've had a bit of a checkered path to it, because I had to take time out through injury or a major diagnosis, and then I did something else for a while because I couldn't get into the professional training. So people's career paths are affected, but I think we're saying sort of don't just get defeated by it, try and kind of keep the spark alive, but look to be flexible about how you get there. Never be afraid to ask someone to be a mentor. They're usually flattered. I think there's probably something in that. And some people were saying, your disability can help you stand out from the crowd, use it. And I think something that people are talking about more and more in networks of disabled people are sort of, people are getting frustrated with only ever talking about barriers. Let's talk about the barriers to employment, the barriers to education, the barriers to everything. Of course, there are loads of barriers. But actually, there are at least a growing, I think, number of people who want to talk about what you bring, what you can contribute. The fact that, and I don't want to stereotype any kind of experience of disability, but some disabled people bring problem solving, resilience, empathy, creativity, all sorts of things that may actually be in part linked to your experience of managing disability, or even linked to the experience of your impairment. And I think there's it mirrors for me a little bit about some of the debates that used to be happening around women and management kind of some years ago when I was a lot younger. Actually maybe this is not just about trying to get to a position of equality based on the same rules, the same expectations. It's something about women may bring different sorts of styles, different kinds of leadership, different models of leadership. And I think disabled people are saying the same thing. We may bring something different. Not just, please can we have the chance to do it the same way that it's done already. And most people also, when we asked, and when people asked each other, could identify sort of defining moments. And often it was like somebody who believed in your potential, or I mean, I can think of a defining moment like that for myself. I had mental health problems when I was young, and I remember when somebody suggested I apply for a promotion. I was in a kind of a job that I was working in a hostel, and I literally thought this person was joking. I was finding it difficult enough to hold myself together at all, never mind think about promotion. Now that may be nothing to do with disability, or it may be, I don't know, but I think a lot of us can probably identify key moments, and key individuals. Might be one moment and it actually kind of made a difference to what happened next. And I think a lot of disabled people can remember that. And it's very often somebody who sees the potential, and sometimes when you've given up believing in what you yourself could do, somebody else kind of thinks maybe you could do something, and then maybe you start to believe you might be able to yourself. We've been running leadership programmes led by disabled people, disabled coaches, disabled facilitators, etc. And these have been mainly not so much career focused, but focused on people who, we've got, for example, disabled people who've been elected as councillors, a disabled person who became a local mayor. There's some people now who want to be these elected police commissioners or whatever they're called. I'm not quite sure what they're called, but anyway, to raise issues about hate crime and whatever. People who want to be school governors and so on. And that's, I think, this emphasis on the positive. I'm terribly aware that it's a bit countercultural to be talking about emphasising the positive, and I'm hoping we have a debate in a minute, because clearly there's an awful lot to be negative about. But I just think there is a role for a sort of countercultural push on aspiration, what's possible, not just what's not possible. And put up some website addresses there. We can put this up in terms of if you want to know more about those leadership programmes. We then thought, right, nobody seemed to know anything much about the experience of disabled people who did well in their careers. very little evidence. So we did the first national survey supported by Lloyds Banking Group. We got over 1,400 responses, disabled and non-disabled people, so we were able to compare. I mean, I'm aware I'm in a university here and somebody could scrutinise the methodology. It was a kind of snowball survey, it wasn't a representative sample, but still we could draw some conclusions. So the first thing is that there is a pool of disabled people in senior jobs. We identified 110 earning more than 80,000. And everybody said to us, these will be people who climbed up the greasy pole and then at some point they had an accident or they had a diagnosis of something and they became a disabled person. In fact, we found that over half of this group had had their impairment for more than 20 years. Some had had it for their whole life. So it didn't seem to be only that people had kind of got to be successful and then had an accident or something in their 50s. There were some like that, but there were many who had succeeded in their careers whilst living with an impairment. I'm not saying for a minute this is a typical experience of disabled people, but it is an experience and one that I don't think people have kind of really looked at very much before. And many people had quite significant impairments, things like bipolar disorder, quadriplegia and so on, and were saying things like, I've suffered from MS for 19 years and so on. And we looked at what were the things that they thought were significant to them in the development of their career. And two things were significant in terms of the responses that we got to that question. One was mentoring, and the other was career-long senior support. It was really about someone who believes in you. It came up very strongly with people with mental health issues. Somebody who believed in me, even through the hard times kind of stuff. The factors that didn't come out as significant were making reasonable adjustments, which I thought was quite interesting. And I think the implication of that might be that, you know, supposing you've got a visual impairment and you need particular technology in order to be able to do your job, that's essential to work at all. But it's not necessarily significant in whether you progress or not. That seemed to be the case. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't significant for anybody, but for anyone at all, but it didn't come out as a significant issue in terms of the most significant issues. It seemed to be more about being prepared to look at people's talents and support people's career development, not kind of cap ambitions, if you like. Just one example of something that somebody said, this last quote on this slide. This is a woman who was an HR director, and she had some time out because she had bipolar disorder, and she hadn't been well. Anyway, she applied for a job as an HR director and got it. So then she was sitting in the job of HR director, and she got the occupational health report on herself, which got sent to her as the HR director, if you see what I mean. And the occupational health report said, on no account employ this person, she's got bipolar disorder. So she said, I filed it away carefully and continued happily in the job. So a lot of people have got those sorts of stories about, you know, how you have to overcome all sorts of assumptions that you won't be able to do things and that you shouldn't be employed and so on. People, I don't know if there's anybody from occupational health backgrounds here. People often tell me that I stereotype occupational health, or the disability rights movement stereotypes occupational health. There's obviously some, you know, very good work in occupational health. But I have to say, when I worked at the Disability Rights Commission, we had loads of cases in which occupational health had said, no, they can't do it because. So I think there is a bit of an issue there. Anyway, because we had both disabled and non-disabled people responding to our survey, we could see that for all this good news, actually, if you started looking at what the disabled and the non-disabled people earned, and we went out through the same pools, through business pools with our survey, what you found was, and I suppose perhaps no surprise, was that in the lower paid jobs, disabled people were more likely to be in the lower paid brackets, and the non-disabled people were more likely to be in the higher paid brackets. So although there's a pool of high paid disabled people, they are a minority. We found that non-disabled people were twice as likely to be board level directors, 3 times as likely to be other directors or heads of department, and disabled people were less likely to get mentoring or that senior career-long support, which were the very things they'd identified as being helpful to their career. So there's a real inequality there. And a lot of disabled I mean, clearly masses of disabled people are not working at all. This is a major crisis. But for those disabled people who are working, a lot are living in work poverty and are concentrated in low-paid jobs. And this is a less discussed crisis, perhaps. We set up a network of senior disabled people called Radiate on the back of this survey because disabled people who are in senior jobs said, actually, we want to meet others and we want to share experiences. It's now got 200 members, and it meets regularly. It's supported by Lloyds Banking Group, and I think it's really influential, actually. It's doing some very interesting things. One of the things they did recently was they invited a panel of recruitment company and executive search people to come and talk with them. And these people from the executive search companies were saying things like, well, of course, we really want to have diverse shortlists and we want to put forward talented disabled people and people from black and minority ethnic communities and so on. But our clients, you have to understand, the employers, they're not always open to that. But there were people in the audience who were employers who said, actually, I've asked for diverse shortlists and I don't get them. And there were other people saying, you have turned me down again and again at the long listing stage because of your assumptions about my disability. So I think that actually they were put under some pressure, these executive search people, and it was good. It was a really good dialogue because they then started to say, actually, we want some help. We want to think about how we do this. Then perhaps we do need to unpick our assumptions and so on. So there's some ongoing dialogue. So they're doing things like that, and I think they're going to talk to the HR professional heads and so on. So it's quite interesting. However, I sometimes when I talk about this kind of stuff about people in senior jobs, there is an obvious charge, which is that you're kind of being rather elitist. This is all very well if you're earning £80,000 a year, but let's face it, most people are not earning £80,000 a year. And let's look then at people who are living in poverty. So we've got in this country over 1 million young unemployed people, generally young people. I don't think we talk nearly enough about the fact that young disabled people are twice as likely to be not in education, employment or training as other young people. I mean, if it's a crisis that we've got over 1 million young disabled people, then isn't that awful? That's bad enough for a young person generally. But if you're a young disabled person, your chances are much lower. And once you've been out of work as a young person for some time, the chances of getting in are significantly reduced the longer you're out of work. So this is really awful. 41% of non-disabled 18 to 24-year-olds are not working, but that's true of 62% of disabled people aged 18 to 24. And I mean, that's just one stark set of statistics. You could equally look at the fact that there's something like 300,000 people leave work every year through ill health or disability. And often they would much rather keep their jobs. Why are they leaving their jobs through ill health or disability? Well, often it's because they're not getting the support they need, and the employer's not getting the support that they need to help them to stay at work with the right adjustments and some support if necessary. I was talking recently to a guy who's quadriplegic and had a major accident, and he just sort of said, do you know, it was a year before anybody talked to me about employment at all. And the thing that made a difference to him was his employer came to visit him quite late on in this process. He'd long ago lost the job. But the employer said, well, do you want to come back? Nobody in the healthcare, there'd been nobody amongst this professional network around this guy who talked to him about the fact that he had a job at the point that he had this accident. And I just think this is still happening too often. Not just with those kind of spinal injury type issues, but people who develop a mental health condition, people who are losing their sight. There's some fantastic good practice around in eye clinics, in mental health teams and so on. But there's also a lot of people who just get the treatment, let's treat you then with physical rehabilitation or whatever it is, so that you get to the point where either we've fixed you or we haven't fixed you, but we've done everything we can to enable you, physically or mentally. We've got the psychiatric treatment to a point where it's reasonably stable. But somehow, during that time and all that's going on, you've lost touch with your employer or your college or whatever it was you were doing before. I mean, this just seems, it's a nonsense, because then, well, anyway, sorry. There's lots of things like this that need some attention, really. So, anyway, I did a review, which was published last summer, into specialist disability employment programmes. It's probably important to say that I was only looking at access to work. Does everybody know what the access to work programme is? I'm sure people, yes, this is a very well-informed audience. I was also looking at Remploy and residential training colleges, but touching on wider issues like work choice and the work programme and a few other issues. And what basically came out was that, unsurprisingly, disabled people, we talked to lots of disabled people, young, old, in work, out of work, different parts of the country, who'd received different sorts of support. And people said, well, we want the chance to work in any job, in any sector, and to have support you can take with you. And I think it is something quite striking that what you think work is going to look like has changed, hasn't it, for young people? So, when I was young, I looked to my parents, who in both cases had a job pretty much for life. They were in the same job for decades, both of my parents. So I grew up with that model in my head, even though my life hasn't been like that. I've gone from this job to that job to the other job. But I think people of the next generations down, they haven't had that parental generation who are in one job for life. It wouldn't occur to them to be in one job for life. So they're looking for something that's about, there might be a whole range of things you do, different jobs, self-employment, portfolios and so on. So you need support that fits that kind of working life. So it's no good just being able to, here's your workplace where you've got some support. It needs to be kind of more flexible than that. And we also, in the course of this review, looked at the evidence, and broadly, this is a bit of a generalisation, but broadly speaking, evidence that's been developed in the world of learning disability, in the world of mental health, in the world of physical rehabilitation, generally suggests that if you're looking at what are the best chances of disabled people getting and keeping employment, generally it's better for people to get into employment with lots and lots and lots of support if needed, with flexible, fluctuating support if needed, rather than to do a lot of preparation first. I mean, that is a bit of a generalisation, and I'd be very open to challenge on it if anybody would like to challenge it.
No, it's a fair generalisation.
Sorry?
It is fair generalisation.
Right. Okay, good. We can perhaps come back to that. Anyway, so therefore, probably there's been quite a lot of activity that's been going on about sort of, the classic thing would be, I've talked to a lot of people with learning difficulties who say, well, I've gone round and round and round these college courses in FE. Some people describe them as like, they've moved the day centre into the FE college, and you're kind of doing all this bits of printing and this and that, but actually it's all meant to be preparation for employment, but you never get to the preparation, you never actually get to the employment. So, but there are other examples of a lot of training rather than what do employers actually need, and I think the general thinking now is like work experience is really important for people generally, nothing to do with disabled people, and you need those kind of different ways in. So, started from those kind of ideas, and some of the proposals then that this review came up with. And this particularly relates to the future of access to work, and I'm hoping that the government, in responding to this review, might do some things to improve access to work. So firstly, it's important that both the employee or the would-be employee and the employer feel confident about taking up this job or taking on this person. And if, as an individual, you can go to an interview saying, okay, I'm deaf, I use British Sign Language. If you if you want to talk about it, this is your under obligation to talk in an interview, but if you want to. So I know that if I got this job, that Access to Work would be able to would pay for an interpreter. And this is how I would work with the interpreter, and this is what it would mean for you, the employer. I think then the employer feels very different than if they've never encountered a deaf person before, they've got no idea about any of it, and they think, oh my God, I couldn't cope with this. You know, how are they going to talk to the clients? How are they going to talk to their colleagues? And particularly in small businesses where, you know, they haven't, some of the large companies, some of the public sector organisations may have HR departments, they may have people who understand something about legislation and good practice and where you can get help and so on. But a lot of small businesses have got no idea. And so you, the individual, will feel potentially more confident if you already know you would be entitled to Access to Work. So we're trying to argue that you should actually know your entitlement. Government always says, well, you can't because it depends on the job, which is a fair point in a way, but I think that you could have an indicative, you know, I work with a lot of disabled people who pretty much always need the same things, whatever the job is, actually. If you need an interpreter, you need an interpreter. You might need it more or less hours a week, depending what the job is, but fundamentally that's your major access need. So if that's the case, then you could have an indicative entitlement. It could be confirmed once you know what the job is, but at least then you go with that kind of confidence. And it gives the employer confidence, very importantly. For the employer, if you're going to take on somebody who has a fluctuating condition, it would be massively helpful if Access to Work would pay something towards cover. If somebody's got multiple sclerosis, let's say, and they know they sometimes have relapses, they sometimes have to be off for periods of time, the employer may be looking at the sickness record and thinking, this is too difficult. I don't understand why Access to Work can't pay the employer, can't pay for cover for a temp. Because it's the same argument as, you can't expect a small employer to pay for an interpreter, but why can you expect a small employer to cover the cost of somebody having chunks of time off with a fluctuating condition? And I know as an employer, I employ people with fluctuating conditions, and it is challenging, It would be massively helpful. Anyway, so that's another recommendation. I think it would be good if people could control their own support more. The system's a bit bureaucratic. I talk with people who go move from one part of the country to another, and you have to go through the assessment process all over again. Sometimes what the answer is depends on which part of the country, so it's a bit kind of variable. Some big employers have set up their own system to improve its consistency. They kind of thought, we don't think the Access to Work programme meets our quality standards in terms of the speed, in terms of the consistency, so we'll do our own. Lloyd's Banking Group's done that, for example, so has the Post Office. But actually, if you could have more control over it and hold the budget if you wanted to, that might help. It's a very successful programme, Access to Work. It recoups about £1.48 for every pound spent on it, roughly. But people don't know about it. They particularly don't know about it in small businesses where arguably they need it most. I've mentioned the fact that I think it needs to be promoted. Interestingly, the number of new people claiming Access to Work in the last 6 months has gone down, which seems to me sad, really. I think there's a risk of the budget being underspent at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because I was just wondering how people can access to work. People I work with who might benefit from it.
Yes, okay. So if you can contact Access to Work, you go through a job centre as your first port of call, but you can contact Access to Work then. They can contact Access to Work and apply for it. Okay. We'd also like to see much better knowledge about kind of what are the different sorts of adjustments and supports that are available, and maybe be able to rate them. I mean, imagine a sort of TripAdvisor for all the kind of chairs and interpreters and technologies and everything else, so that you could... Because at the moment, it's sort of like the experts hold the information in a way, and there's a real role for experts, don't get me wrong, for people to do ergonomic assessments and things. But for some people, it's just really very simple. I need a desk that's lower. can I please find out what are the different desks that are lower and how much are they? And then a big company can just buy it, or an individual might even buy it if they're self-employed, if it's not particularly expensive, and just speed things up rather than lots of assessment and bureaucracy. Okay, Remploy, right. The broad consensus amongst disabled people's organisations in the review was that the model of having distinct factories or businesses sort of specifically to offer employment for disabled people, albeit there might be some non-disabled people working there as well, but that particular model wasn't what the majority of people thought was the kind of the right model for the 21st century or for going forward. People felt it had been very important for its time, but that there was something that didn't seem right about the idea that because you're disabled, you'll go and work in a factory making X, where you might want the choice of doing anything in any part of the economy. And people who went into Remploy factories, say 20 or 30 years ago, in some cases had, let's say, a physical impairment. And that was a time when, there was a lot of, perhaps there was more manual work around, and it was more difficult to find other kinds of work. Whereas now, arguably, if you have a physical impairment, there's quite a lot of customer service, office, etc., kind of jobs that, in theory, you might be able to do. But the other thing about this is that the way the money is spent is that for every person who's working in a Remploy factory at the moment, it costs on average about £26,000 a year. For every person who is supported to get and keep a mainstream job, it's maybe a fifth of that, maybe less. So there's also an argument about, if you buy the argument, which you may not, that the factory model isn't necessarily the right way forward, there's also a question about, when you go back to this, all those large numbers of young unemployed disabled people who've got no support to get into work, that more people could be supported with the same resource that's going into the factory model. Most of the main disability, certainly the organisations led by disabled people, were consistently of the view that this wasn't the model, it was time for change, you had to bite the bullet and so on, but the individuals must have their rights protected and be offered really good support. Trade unions who represent the interests of people working in the factories rightly are trying to keep, support their jobs and therefore want to keep the factories open. And this is a very politically charged debate, and the more so in a difficult economic climate where if these enterprises close, then what job opportunities will there be? On the other hand, if the money's tied up in them, there's a whole lot of other people not getting their employment needs met either. So, it's genuinely difficult, I think. And I don't think it's particularly party political. The last government was trying to address this issue as well. And they did start a kind of what they called a modernisation programme. Maybe we could discuss that in a second. Residential training colleges as well, I looked at. And these are specialist colleges specifically for disabled people that typically offer vocational courses in all sorts of things, catering, truck driving, all sorts of things. Some of them, I have to say, have got some absolutely fantastic sort of exemplary kind of technology, so things like adaptation to losing your sight and how you learn everything from cooking to navigation to everything. So it's a kind of rounded programme. It's vocational, but it also can cover a whole lot of other things about independent living. But on the other hand, you're kind of going out of area, so you do your vocational course, but then what are the links back to you being able to get a job where you came from? And also it serves a very, very small number of people compared to the number of the same people there are, and it's very expensive per head, more expensive than a Remploy factory place. So, question, could the expertise in those colleges be shared more with ordinary FE colleges? Can't we get inclusion in regular FE colleges enhanced and improved and so on. I think this is all quite tricky and is exercising the minds of people at DWP. I suppose I would just say three things that I suppose I'm particularly trying to encourage government to say yes on in this review, because they will be responding sometime in the first half of 2012, is that there should be fairer opportunities for disabled people to get into employment. Access to work doesn't cover being an intern. It doesn't, whatever you think of internships. If you need a support worker to be with you while you do your internship, access to work won't cover it. Now, it seems to me that's just entirely unfair. If we think, I know that internships might be unfair anyway, and that's a separate question, but if some people are benefiting from them, it surely is not fair that disabled people can't benefit from them, those people who have a support need that doesn't get met. So you have to have an actual paid long-term job to get access to work. So that would be not a very major policy change, and it would go completely with the flow of government policy. It's about, more disabled people should be working, we've got to help young people get jobs and so on. Secondly, access to work should be vigorously promoted, particularly to people working in small businesses and to small businesses themselves, and to groups who currently underuse it, notably people with mental health conditions. The proportion's gone up from 0.8% of access to work claimants to something just under 2%, I think. But considering that 43% of people on incapacity benefits are people with mental health conditions, it's still pretty pathetic. And it's not much better on learning disability. And I think the other thing is the role of peer support, which is kind of where I started. I think peer support's really powerful, and local disabled people's organisations could really play a part in putting people in touch with others who are using similar kinds of supports or adjustments, etc., and I think we'd like to see, rather than just the sort of bureaucratic machinery of the state, if you like, a stronger role for local disabled people's organisations. And there's been some moves to the voluntary sector being more involved in access to work. Tell me how I'm doing for time, because I can either stop or I can talk a little bit about something else that's related.
Oh, fine, we've got about half an hour.
A few more minutes and then open it up for discussion? Okay. All right. Okay. The other thing I just want to say was it's all very well having these programmes, however good they are, but you've also got to think about employers. I mean, if employers aren't going to offer you jobs or enable you to keep your job, then you can have the most brilliant programmes under work choice, access to work, the work programme or anything else, and it won't make any difference at all. And one of the things that the UK Commission for Employment and Skills has been looking at is the fact that very few employers are recruiting people who don't have high levels of qualification. So and particularly school leavers. So only 6% of employers recruit 16-year-old school leavers, and 22% recruit college leavers. People tend to use qualifications as a filter. Now, I suppose being in the university, I mean, quite right too. Degrees are important and so on, you could say. But if we set the bar of qualification too high, we are disadvantaging some people, clearly. So I think there is a case for saying we would like to encourage employers to think about the routes in to employment. And some employers do. I think KPMG, for instance, recruit people directly after A-level, and then they train them. And I just think it's quite good to have different routes into employment, because I think disabled people have probably not benefited from this trend towards, you always have to have a degree or you have to have qualifications to do things. There's some research that suggests that employers, although there's a general view in the press that employers can't bear the fact that people come through who are not very good at literacy and numeracy and so on, the evidence suggests that's not really what employers are most worried about. They're most concerned about people who don't have any experience. This is why work experience and internships and so on are so important. Employers want people who are going to be able to get on with it, who are going to get on with other people, who are going to get on with the job and so on. I'm not saying that they don't think qualifications are important, they do, but that's the main complaint is about people not having those kind of work-related routines and skills and so on. It's not so much about literacy and numeracy and so on. So work experience is really, really, really important. So employers could offer more routes in, recruit non-graduates as well as graduates. They could move away from word-of-mouth recruitment, particularly SMEs, and offer high-quality work experience that gives you some real development opportunities. I mean, there is some terrible work experience. There was a case recently where somebody was doing some voluntary work for a cancer charity and then was told that she had to go and do unpaid work experience stacking shelves in a supermarket. So the supermarket gets free labour. The person was doing something she enjoyed as a volunteer and had to stop doing it as a condition of her benefits. I mean, it can get ridiculous, but assuming it's good work experience, it gives you genuine development opportunities and gives you better chance of employment at the end, then, surely a good thing. And I think there's some sort of implication, so that's sort of what employers can do. And what perhaps providers can do is support individuals through peer support and evidence-based approaches. So it's this thing about not too many stepping stones, lots of support for real work experience and employment. And supporting the employer. Really important to support the employer. But also the government has got a role, haven't they? Probably rather a large role. So things like apprenticeships, the way health and social care operates, the way welfare reform operates, these things ought to be enabling to people, to disabled people, to get and keep jobs and to progress. And at the moment, I think you could argue that some of that is definitely not happening. There is a cross-government ministerial group now on disability employment, which is a good thing, but there's not nearly enough disabled people getting apprenticeships. In fact, the numbers have gone down slightly. And welfare reform, well, I'm sure we could have another few hours on that. But all these stories about scroungers in the press and this kind of release of statistics that, 1 week it's the number of people who weren't born in Britain who are claiming benefits, the next week it's people who've used drugs and alcohol or whatever. There's a kind of rhetoric around about people not deserving benefits and so on, which is having a huge impact on disabled people. And it doesn't help people's employment prospects, because if you're an employer, why would you want to recruit somebody who's just been described to you as a scrounger, probably addicted to drugs, possibly, all that. It's very, very stigmatising and very, very unhelpful, and I think the government has a leadership role, personally, in trying to do something about that. So that's what I really wanted to say. But just to mention about Disability Rights UK, we support the all-party parliamentary group on disability. We campaign with other disability charities on issues like welfare reform, the future of social care, employment, education, etc. I mentioned we have a publication called Into Higher Education. It's on our website, free to download, as is that Doing Careers Differently report I mentioned, and the research I mentioned. It's all free to download from our website. And I've put up some websites. We haven't quite merged our websites yet, so I've put them all up there. Sorry about that. We will have merged them shortly. We also do something called Surviving and Thriving at Work, which supports individuals to support their well-being, including people with fluctuating conditions and impairments. Okay, that's it. I'd welcome any challenge or disagreement or questions or anything else.
Thanks very much for that very thought-provoking talk, which there might be some controversial issues, so let's have some questions or discussion. Okay. Andrew.
Well, I'm very glad that you're making a distinction between